George Carlin had always watched Richard Pryor from a careful distance, close enough to admire, far enough to understand they were built from entirely different things. Then one evening in the mid-1970s, Pryor walked off a stage in the middle of a show, and sometime in the hours that followed, Carlin picked up the phone. Nobody was in the room when that call happened. No tape was running. No one took notes. But the people who had watched both men work over the years, in clubs and dressing rooms and backstage corridors from New York to Los Angeles, would later say that the call had happened and that it had mattered, in the quiet way that things matter when they are not performed for anyone's benefit. By the mid-1970s, both men had already changed what American comedy was allowed to be. They had done it separately, without coordination, coming from different starting points and traveling different roads. Carlin had remade himself in the early years of that decade, shed the clean suit and the television smile, and replaced them with something rawer and more deliberate. Pryor had never worn the clean suit at all. He had started differently, arrived differently, and what he had built by the mid-1970s was unlike anything comedy had produced before. They moved in the same world without occupying the same space in it. They appeared on some of the same stages, were discussed in the same critical conversations, were placed in the same sentence by writers who needed a shorthand for what serious American comedy looked like in the 1970s. But they were not the same. The distance between them was not competitive. It was something more like the distance between two craftsmen who had each found a different and genuine way to do the most difficult version of the same work. Carlin knew this. Pryor knew this. And each man, in his own way, respected it. What Pryor had, that almost no one else in comedy possessed, was the ability to be completely transparent about damage. Not as a confession designed to earn sympathy, but as comedy, as the most unflinching possible account of the most difficult possible experiences, converted into something an audience could sit with and recognize and laugh at, because the alternative was to simply look away. He made audiences laugh at things they were ashamed to laugh at, and then, before the laughter had fully faded, showed them why the shame was less interesting than the truth underneath it. But by the mid-1970s, Pryor was also carrying something heavier than most people watching from the audience could see. The material demanded it. Being that honest about damage, night after night, in rooms full of strangers who had come specifically to watch you be that exposed, takes something out of a person that does not come back between shows. The performances were extraordinary. What they cost was harder to account for. There were nights when it held, and there were nights when it didn't. On one of the nights that didn't hold, Pryor walked off a stage. The precise circumstances of that evening belong to the private ledger Pryor kept of his own most difficult experiences and never fully opened for public view. What is recoverable is the shape of it. A show that fractured mid-performance, a performer who stopped, a room that went quiet in a way it hadn't been meant to go quiet, and then the particular, uncomfortable silence of a venue attempting to close an evening it had not planned to close. For any performer, walking off a stage is a specific kind of failure, not simply a professional failure, but something more interior. A moment when the contract between performer and audience breaks in a way that cannot be repaired by the next night's show. For Pryor, who performed from so much closer to the nerve than almost anyone else in American comedy, those moments carried additional weight. They were not simply bad nights. They were small collapses of the mechanism that made everything possible. Sometime in the hours after that particular night, George Carlin picked up the phone. It was not a call that anyone had arranged or suggested. Carlin was not, by temperament, a man who reached out impulsively. He thought before he spoke, in private as in his material. He said what he meant and meant what he said. He did not offer gestures he did not believe in. If he picked up the phone, he had a reason for picking it up. To understand what connected these two men, it helps to understand how different their comedy actually was, and why that difference made the connection more unusual, not less. Carlin had arrived at his mature voice through a deliberate process of self-examination and reinvention. He had looked at the comedian he was in the 1960s, polished, television-ready, careful, and had decided that version was not honest enough. Not dishonest, exactly. He had not been lying, but he had been saying less than he knew, and at a certain point, he had found that he could no longer sustain the gap between what he observed and what he was willing to say on stage. The albums he released in the early 1970s, Class Clown in 1972, Occupation Fool in 1973, were the result of closing that gap. They were the work of a man who had decided to use the stage the way a serious writer uses the page, to say something true and let the consequences follow. His comedy was about systems, about language, the way it was used to soften reality, to make uncomfortable things sound acceptable, to create distance between people and the facts of their lives. It was angry in a way that sounded almost philosophical, which meant it could be heard in mixed company without anyone feeling directly accused. He observed from a slight elevation, not cold, but precise. He built his material the way a craftsman builds something meant to hold, with intention, with patience, with an eye toward structure. Pryor built his from the inside out. His material was autobiographical in a way that had almost no precedent in American stand-up comedy. He drew from a childhood in Peoria that most people would have spent a lifetime trying to unsee. He talked about addiction, about race, about the specific daily experience of being a black man in America in the 1960s and 1970s. Not as argument, not as observation from a safe distance, but as testimony. He stood at the center of the most painful material he could find and reported from there in real time, while the audience sat with whatever they were feeling and tried to figure out if it was laughter. Carlin admired this openly. In interviews, he spoke of Pryor with a warmth and specificity he reserved for very few people. He understood that what Pryor was doing required a kind of courage that was different from the courage his own material demanded. Not more, exactly, but more exposed. Where Carlin's comedy was structured like an argument, Pryor's was structured like a wound held open. The audience could not look away, and Pryor never asked them to. What passed between them during that call is not something either man discussed in detail, publicly, at any point in their lifetimes. The call appears in the historical record mostly as a shadow, a reference here, a pause in an interview there, a sentence from someone who knew both of them that confirms, quietly, that it happened, and that it had not been forgotten. Neither man was the kind of person who opened the interior of a private conversation for other people to examine. But it is possible to understand something of what that conversation might have contained based on who these men were and what they understood about the particular work they were both doing. Carlin did not call to console in the conventional sense. He would have understood that conventional sympathy, the kind that begins with, "I'm sorry about tonight," and moves through reassurance toward resolution, was not what Pryor needed, and would likely have been heard as a diminishment by a man who had spent his career resisting other people's management of his experience. Carlin knew this. He was perceptive about how people worked. He called because he understood the thing that had happened from the inside. He had stood in front of rooms and felt the weight of what a room can demand. He had felt the specific pressure of performing material that costs something, that requires you to mean what you are saying and gives you very little protection when the meaning runs out. He had not performed at the level of exposure that Pryor operated at, but he had gone far enough into honest territory to understand the shape of the problem. He called because sometimes the only useful thing, after a night like that, is knowing there is someone on the other end of the line who does not need it explained. Someone who has been on a stage and knows what it feels like when the mechanism breaks, and who does not require a coherent account of the failure, and does not expect you to perform recovery or resolve or gratitude. The call was probably short. Carlin was not built for long emotional conversations, and that was not what Pryor needed. What Pryor needed, in all likelihood, was the call itself, the fact of someone reaching out who understood, without having to demonstrate their understanding at length. In the years that followed, both men continued. Pryor went on to produce what many critics still consider the single greatest stand-up performance ever filmed, Richard Pryor, Live in Concert, recorded in 1979. A performance of extraordinary density and fearlessness from a man who had come through more than most people could fully account for. Carlin went on to produce work that grew increasingly unsparing and precise, increasingly certain of what it was looking for and how to find it. They spoke of each other in interviews with a warmth each reserved for very few people. Carlin spoke of Pryor as someone who had permanently changed what comedy was allowed to be, not by arguing for the permission, but by simply doing it and paying the cost when the cost was required. Pryor spoke of Carlin as one of the few people in comedy he considered genuinely serious. Serious about the work, not about the business of the work. They were not close friends in the conventional sense. They did not socialize often. They moved through the same world in different orbits. What they had was more specific than friendship, a mutual recognition of the weight of the work, and a quiet, clear-eyed awareness of what it cost the other person to keep doing it. The phone call was part of that recognition. One evening, one of them was in the worst place, and the other picked up the phone. No one recorded it. Nothing about that call appeared in any article or any interview in any recoverable form. It existed only in the private memory of two men who understood each other in a way that did not require explanation. There is a particular quality in the comedy both men made at their best, a quality of honesty that does not apologize for itself, that does not soften its edges for the comfort of the listener. It comes from a decision each of them made, at some point along the way, that the truth was more important than being liked. That decision costs something. It accumulates. There are evenings when it costs more than can be absorbed alone. On one of those evenings, one of the two men who had made that decision reached out to the other, not to fix anything, not to say something extraordinary, just to make sure there was someone on the other end of the line. And that was enough.